Good morning, all. We are glad that you are here, and I want to make sure we have ample opportunity for Carol to teach. Carol is the only teacher I know who tries to put 10 pounds of sugar in a 5-pound bag. And so every moment is worthwhile for us to be with her. This is the first of 3 distinct classes, and she'll talk about God's time or man's time, biblical use of light and darkness. And that also gets ready for us around daylight savings time. Is that right? Yeah. I used to know when I was a boy a poem about daylight savings time. I wish I could remember it. It was an old Pennsylvania Dutch poem about, why you would change time. And I remember being a tyke and reciting that in my grade school. My father taught me that poem. I wish I could remember it. But Carol, thank you for coming and being with us.
I'm delighted to see you all today on this beautiful day that we have been blessed with to see Mother Nature. Now, if Mother Nature could give us some rain, but not a flood, we would be totally content. But we never are quite content with the weather here. That's the number one subject of that people have to talk about. Now, I got kind of interested in this topic. Why is my slide not moving? Now it is. Okay. In 1995, I returned to teaching. I had been pretty much a stay-at-home mother. I taught older woman's Bible Sunday school class here, the Lydian class, and I really came to know those women quite well, and they really boosted my confidence about getting a teaching job. And so I returned to teaching, and I took the early morning classes for a couple of reasons. Number one, I was driving from right over here to Gallatin 5 days a week, and it was about a 35-minute drive, and I was going against the traffic, which was a really good thing. And then the other little piece of that as to why those classes were good was that I got out of the house early, and Ray could deal with getting the kids out of bed and getting them to school, getting them headed to school. And so I started getting up. My clock was set at 4:45 every day. Now I think about how did I ever do that for so long? But nonetheless, I would get up at 4:45. The house was quiet. Nobody was up but me. And this was when I started looking really intently out the windows of our kitchen. Now, a lot of you have been in our house, and our kitchen has a window that faces north. Our breakfast table does, a window that faces north, and then another big window that faces west. And so I was able to sit there and observe the change of the seasons and everything that was going on over there. Don Schultze and Ann came over there one night, and Don looked out the kitchen window and says, "This looks like a golf course to me." And I said, "Well, the golf course, which is from the edge of our driveway down to Bowling Avenue, it's not that part of the golf course. That our property, that all belongs to the neighbors 1, 2, and 3 doors down." And so, but I started watching things much more carefully out those windows than I ever had before. And I also, because it was a quiet time of the day and I'd had my shower, I had my lessons all prepared, I was ready to go. I started reading Phyllis Tickle's Divine Hours, which are prayers for the season. And I have continued that since 1995. Now, my books are masking taped together. They've been used so much. And then I seem to have become a collector of phrases and scriptures. And some of those came out of Phyllis Tickle's Divine Hours. And I've read those books for so many years that I can pretty much quote all of the scriptures once I get the first 2 or 3 words to it. But one of the things in the yard next to us that I found really intriguing was a big sycamore tree. Now, this is not their sycamore tree, but this was, I couldn't go out there this morning and take a picture of it because the leaves haven't come off. But when the leaves come off this sycamore, they are identified by the fact that their bark is so white. And so as the sun is coming up in the east, that sycamore begins to glow. And then in the evening, the shadows of the evening make the tree's shadows so amazingly long and beautiful. So that was really kind of my first introduction into paying attention to the seasons and paying attention to how things changed. Now, another thing that got me kind of interested in this was that when I came from Texas over here to graduate school, and my parents and I drove across the Mississippi River Bridge, there was a big sign hanging right in the middle of the river that said, "Welcome to the 3 states of Tennessee." And when Winfield Dunn got elected governor, the first thing he ordered was take that sign down. And so that sign came down, and the 3 states of Tennessee were the 3 grand divisions. Now, the funny thing about that is that the grand divisions initially started out with the Tennessee River, which starts over just above Knoxville, where the Holston and French Broad rivers come together and form the Tennessee. And then it makes this big U. It goes down about to Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain, then down into Alabama, makes a big U through the Muscle Shoals, and then makes an up over there around Shiloh, the Shiloh battlefield, and goes up to the Ohio River. And so that's why that area between, I guess, Clarksville and Dover, and then Henry County, that area is called the land between the lakes, because the TVA built one of those lakes and another one was built by the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers were very upset when Franklin Roosevelt created a whole new institution to fix the rivers, because they were expecting that big pot of money for river improvement to be in their pocket. So nonetheless, they come together and they go up to the Ohio River, and the mouth of those 2 rivers is 10 or 12 miles apart, not too far from Paducah, Kentucky. So I had started teaching Tennessee history and started really paying attention to driving across Tennessee, because I've always been interested in geography. And I could see that river, if you went from Memphis to Knoxville, you'd cross the Tennessee River 2 times. And another thing I noticed was that we weren't all in the same time zone. And so I really became perplexed about that. And how did that line get drawn? Well, you probably know how. It was politics, pure and simple. It started out that only Bristol was going to be in Eastern time. And then the people in Chattanooga and Knoxville, everybody started fighting about wanting to be in Eastern time. So nonetheless, I've been kind of following this little story all of these years. And a couple of weeks ago, A.J. Levine was teaching, and she was talking about the Gospel of John. And this really struck me as something I'd never paid attention to in John. I had not drawn the connection between Genesis 1 and John 1, the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And so here is God. The first thing he creates is light. And I saw that in a whole different fashion after AJ was talking about that was what the book of John was patterned on. He said, let there be light, and light will be, the time will be divided between light and dark. And he called the day light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning of the first day. So here is the Gospel of John, and I'm not going to read this all to you, but it's pretty much the same thing. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so I started thinking about metaphors for God and Jesus. Now, you all can think of probably 10. You can probably name them off the list. In addition to Jesus and God or our light, what are some others? Well, number two, well, actually, number one on the list, if you look at my King James version of the Bible's Concordia, number one that has more references than light is shepherd. And God is the good shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. There are lots of references to the shepherd in the Old Testament as well as New. And so then this list kind of continues, and you can think of some others. I know you can. I know you can think of some. God as a father. Now, feminists don't necessarily support that, but I think that is what the King James Version said, and that's what I'm still accustomed to, even though the thoueth and all of those THs on the end of words sometimes I find unusual, since I don't really speak that way. Jesus and God, the Savior. Light. God is my rock. Now, because I grew up around a lot of musicians, I probably know a song about in the old Baptist hymnal about every single one of these words, because my God is a rock in a weary land, shelter in the time of storm, King of King, the vine, and we are the branches, and we are the clay, the bread of life, the shield, refuge, Savior, love. Now, once you start kind of paying attention to things like this, and you start paying attention, in my case, mostly to the word light, because I was so kind of focused on light in different time zones and whatnot, you really start seeing them everywhere. And in the bulletin today, there were at least 2 references to light. And there's always references to some of these things in every order of worship. Our baptismal rite has the word light in it as well. Send out your light that it may lead us and bring us to your holy hill and dwelling. So teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts to wisdom. See to it then, the light inside you is not darkness. Therefore, if your whole body is full of light and no part of it dark, it will be just as full of light as when a lamp shines its light on you. So these verses, the Bible is filled with these references to the subject of light, and you start seeing this all over the place. Be careful how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of your time. So don't sit there all day long on your phone looking at cute cats that your college roommates had once upon a time. The trees, to the tree of life, yes, that's in there too. I'm sure there are more, many, many more of these. So last year in September, we became a little bit unpresbyterian because St. George's was offering a hike on the Camino de Santiago for their members, and they suddenly had some empty spots when people backed out, and one of Ray's law partners goes to that church. So we got invited to do the last 80 or so miles of the Camino. We got invited to do it with them. Now, this was pretty easy walking in terms of the hiking Ray and I have done over the years, thanks to Kathy, we got introduced to the Rocky Mountain National Park because her parents had donated a cabin out there, and we took our kids out to the YMCA of the Rockies for years, and we hiked, and we put our kids in the kids program, and we hiked every day. And John sometimes went with us, our older child, but mostly he didn't want to do it. He found it pretty monotonous, and so he was willing after one day of hiking. But the hiking of the Camino was really quite an interesting experience, because as you see here, all of the markers on the Camino, from going over the Pyrenees all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, have these concrete posts with that sunlight there. And Santiago, I have to say, is one of the most magnificent cities I have ever seen. If you know how you look at a place you travel, in some part depends on the weather. And you know, when the sun is shining on that cathedral, it really is quite a spectacular place. So Ray and I hiked that and really enjoyed it. And for any of you who want to do it, the last 80 or 90 miles is not hard hiking. It's not as hard as Gagne Ridge at Radnor Lake, or the Mossy Ridge Trail at Warner Park. It's not nearly that, there are not those many steeps. And it's mostly paved the whole way. And, you know, you can stop along and eat here and there at these various little cafes and whatnot. And by the way, Joe Gaines organized a great hike for us. He was going to lead a hike of some church folks. This was when? Before COVID, I think. And we were going to hike Hadrian's Wall in between England and Scotland. Well, it turned out after all of this, Joe's planning and getting it all arranged, that their daughter Amanda was pregnant and going to have a baby. And so that nixed Joe and Lokil's trip. So anyway, we went without you, but we'll go with you another time. I know you haven't forgiven that grandchild, have you? I mean, you just keep her in a closet all the time, right? But that was a very lovely hike, and it had some ups and downs, but it was quite a pleasant hike. And once again, only the very last day did we have to get our rain gear out, which I thought was pretty phenomenal. So if you look at this picture, you can't really see it very well, but right there is the cathedral in Santiago. Now, what is so special about this cathedral? Well, first of all, somebody in the Catholic Church claimed to have found the bones of the Apostle James, who was mentioned in the sermon this morning by Adam, who preached from about the seats at the table, and where James and John wanted to be in heaven. And so anyway, they claim to have the bodies there in a crypt underneath this cathedral that was built around it. And there are pilgrims who cross the Pyrenees and do the whole thing. And that's the harder part of the hike. The Spanish part is not very hard, but next year we're going to do the Portuguese route from Lisbon to Santiago and see what that is like. But nonetheless, people, yes. And earlier in September, I think Mark and Andy Bentley did part of the route up from Portland. And look, yeah. And the crossing the Pyrenees is the hardest part. And, you know, it's like anywhere else you hike or walk. You'll talk to these people for a while and this group for a while. And there was a group of people from Australia hiking, and they had been over there for 2 months, and they had flown into France and they had done the walk across the Pyrenees, and they didn't have hotel reservations, and they pretty much had a sleeping bag and slept on pews in churches. And so I don't think my husband would like that kind of camping anymore, although he's the one that likes to camp. So all of that is to say, there's Ray, and that's Gareth Aden and John Markham, well, Gareth is Ray's law partner, but nonetheless, they've been hiking together for years, the three of them. And so there they were in front of this. And if you ever get a chance to see it, be sure you go to a mass on Saturday morning, because that's when they bless all the pilgrims. It's really quite interesting. And so I'm going to segue from that into God's time, because we pay attention to time, and Americans seem to be especially in a rush a whole lot of time. And this is a quote from Henry Van Dyke. Now, did you know, I bet Guy knows this, I know Guy knows this. He graduated from Princeton undergraduate and divinity school and became a Presbyterian minister. But he wrote a lot of poems and essays and things of that nature too. So he said, the Europeans see us as just full of energy and constantly on the move and moving fast. So we got to talk a little bit about how people started recognizing time. And so here you've got the Egyptians. I mean, everything starts there in that little corner of the Mediterranean Sea. And they came up with the sundial, and they could kind of get the shadows of the sun on this sundial. And that was kind of one of the very first ways that people started looking at time. And so for a while, they really weren't even having 12 hours and 12 hours. They were in all sorts of different configurations. Now, I know several of you have been to this cathedral in England. Whoops, where did that go? That's the Salisbury Cathedral there, and it supposedly has the oldest working clock in the world. This clock, and you see how complicated the clock was when they finally, took advantage of the pendulum. Well, what happened there? It's on my screen. Well, I'm not sure where it is. Huh. It's on my screen in no signal. Well, it's a pretty complicated looking thing with a lot of cogs and whatnot. But, people really weren't paying a lot of attention to time, number one, because nobody really had clocks and watches. And so time, thank you, let there be light. Ah, yes. And so people weren't really particular about time because, most people it was kind of a more or less agricultural economy. And the people who did live in the cities had churches with bells, and bells would be rung at certain times, like when it's time to go to school, when it's time to go to church, when there's a fire. The first fire department in Nashville, the bells that Adelicia Ackland had given to the First Presbyterian Church, now Downtown Presbyterian Church, but that she had given to them, that became the alarm for the fire department in the city of Nashville. But this does look rather complicated, and it's claimed to be the oldest clock, and they finally got the thing working again, but it's not up in the steeple of that church. And so here you've got Galileo and his work with the pendulum, and then you've got somebody else coming up with a wall clock, something that was a little more compact than this great big device. And so people then can start buying clocks, but clocks were exclusively the property of the wealthiest people all over Europe. They were the only ones that could afford this. And the other people who were working people, they looked at the sun and they left and went. So here comes the pocket watch in 1510, and it's a pretty cumbersome thing, and it has all those little bitty cogs inside it that are, you know, if you've ever seen, I mean, I think everybody in here is old enough to remember a wristwatch that had all of that, that you went and had cleaned once a year and other things before the digital age. And then here is the only well, I won't say he's the only person in American history I would like to meet, but he's the person I think I would enjoy the company of more than some of the stodgier ones. And this is Ben Franklin. And so he was just filled with witticisms about time. A stitch in time saves nine. He was full of himself all the time. And so he was a very lively addition to the founding fathers. Did he really invent daylight savings time? Probably not. But that's been said a lot along the way, that people, because he was over in Paris and he was the king of he was the attraction of Paris because he had this beaver hat on and he looked so out of place in Parisian society. And so they decided that he was creating daylight savings time. And he did a lot of other things. He was so inventive and so creative. And he's one of these people whose mind just is thinking up something new every minute. And so he was quite a contribution to the founding fathers and to for example, the Constitutional Convention, which I'm going to talk about in 2 weeks. He was not a Presbyterian, but the Presbyterians had a lot to do with what is in the Constitution. So here's one of Ben Franklin's witticisms about time. You need to get to bed early. You don't need to stay up all night watching television or surfing the internet. And here these churches had bells, and somebody had to ring them. And then they had clocks on the front of the churches. We have bells in our steeple, but we don't have a clock. But nonetheless, the churches had clocks. Government buildings had some clocks in some kind of tower, and schools, look at West End Middle School down here, had a clock there too. But time wasn't really necessarily needing to be managed until here come the railroads. And here come the railroads. They build these tracks. And the problem that nobody considered when they were doing this, well, if you've got one train coming from the north going south and one going north on the same track at the same time, what's gonna happen? Now, they were way away from this Dutchman's Curve train collision here that was a time mistake. Over here, the worst train disaster in American history. And actually, there's a plaque out in the vestibule to one of our members. It doesn't say that he was killed in that train wreck, but he was. And so anyway, you had to worry about these train collisions and what was going to happen. And so here you've got these big engines, and if the cars go off the track, the danger is people will get killed. And if they're on a bridge, it will be even a bigger calamity. So there began to be a few calamities. Here is one that was up in Rhode Island. And then Tennessee, of course, wants to have trains too. So the South gets trains eventually. And here you see a map of Tennessee and our first railroads here. And you see the map of the Eastern United States there. So we finally get some action with Congress trying to pass a railroad act to keep the time organized a little bit better. And so we're going to start thinking about a train that will go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, the Transcontinental Railroad. And there is an old book that really is one of my favorites. It's called Nothing Like It in the World. And I know, Joe, you've read that book, and a lot of you have, but it's about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So if you're looking for something to read, that's an older book, but it's really quite interesting. So here we've got a professor who gets involved and says, we're going to have some control over all of this business about time. So we need some control over it. And he was at a girls' school in New York, I think, and he organized a meeting to come up with some way to manage time everywhere. So he came up with this idea of time zones across the United States. And as you see, the lines are incredibly straight in these zones, but this was his system that he worked out. And so this was not going to work very well because everybody had a little bit different time as they were setting them, but now everybody here between one line and the other had to have the same time at the same time. So he came up with these zones here, and it seemed to be something that would work and could work. So still we have a lot of trouble. So this is where a Canadian comes in and he says, we got to do the whole globe this way. And so, how long does it take the Earth to rotate? They created 24 time zones in 1878. And they really thought this was going to be the solution. And more or less, it has been the solution. They set Greenwich in England, which is, I guess, up the Thames River from London. You can take a boat. Ray and I did that once, took a boat up there to see all of the clocks and whatnot that had gone into this. And it was quite interesting. But nonetheless, they came up with these very, very straight lines. And so then, of course, people start, there's always somebody who doesn't like what you've done. And so they start really talking about railroad time, and they really start talking about controlling time much more regulated. Now look at the lines here, the time zones. And so here you've got this long, skinny state of Tennessee, and the only part of Tennessee that was going to be in the eastern zone was Bristol. And so Knoxville and Chattanooga and all the rest of us were going to be in central. And Chattanooga was one of the first to rebel against this, and they went to the Federal Trade Commission, was the one that was managing this, and they went to them and said, we want to be in the same time zone as Atlanta. And so they got themselves moved into Eastern time. Well, then, of course, who's going to be next? Knoxville. Yes, you got it. Knoxville is going to say, well, we want to be on Eastern time too. So Tennessee, our line has never been static. It has moved many times. And it's not assured that it won't get moved again. So here we've got train wrecks, we've got cartoons, and the ICC was created to try to be the police over all of this activity. And so, as you see, the railroads had lots and lots of mileage, and I've got a couple more. And this is how we went from 1850 to 1860, before the Civil War. And then by 1870, we had 84,000 miles. So the railroads went very, very rapidly, but they weren't without accidents, even with the time zones. So here you see the central time zone there, and that line between Knoxville and Nashville got moved several different times. And so do people in Tennessee like regulation? I think, it's not going to please everybody. So, it's always, we want to change something here one way or another. So then here comes Herbert Hoover. I mean, not Herbert Hoover, excuse me. World War I, here comes Woodrow Wilson. And so he comes up with the idea that because we need to support the war effort in World War I, and keep in mind, the war broke out in 1914. The United States did not enter it until late 1917. So we were not really over there in the trenches losing men like Germany, England, and France lost in that war. So nonetheless, the United States ultimately goes to war against Germany. And so that is when Congress and others at Woodrow Wilson decide that we need to provide more hours of daylight for the workers in these plants that are doing war production. And so that's when the United States first goes on to daylight savings time. And it's a temporary matter. Imagine it's very short-lived. People don't like it. And I mean, I bet everybody in here has a few complaints about the time change, how hard it is for your bodies to get used to it. And so, and then when we go back to regular time here in a couple of weeks, it's going to be hard for us to go back. So Ray, my husband, is always saying he thinks we should just get one way and stick with it instead of all this changing. But here it is. So we've got the U.S. Capitol being turned forward for the first time for daylight savings time in the war. Well, in the midst of all of this, before the war ends, we have the Dutchman's Curve accident over here, which was really the biggest railroad catastrophe in American history. It made the papers all over the United States with all of the deaths from those two trains because somebody left the station too early. And so it was a terrible, terrible calamity. So here we've got Georgia in Eastern time in 1941. Here comes World War I. And the first time Knoxville went to the ICC to get approval of moving into Eastern time, the ICC said no. And they wanted to do it because of Chattanooga. So there was this huge, huge debate. And then here comes Harry Truman. Fast forward, we're now finished with the Depression and World War II. So here comes Harry Truman, and he authorizes daylight savings time for everybody? No, states' rights. It's up to the states to decide whether they want to or not. Well, you can imagine what a mess that's going to be. I mean, that anybody could figure that out. But hey, those volunteers beat Alabama, didn't they? Excuse me. Now, so Knoxville really, really wants to be in Eastern time, and they finally get the map, the line drawn so that they are in Eastern time. All right, so 2 years later, you see that line moving because some counties that are outside of Knox County want to be with Knoxville. And so, we start moving that line, and the ICC approves the moving of one county or another specifically into Eastern time. Now, this is where the story becomes comical. And not that I would ever say our dignified Tennessee General Assembly is comical, but sometimes they are. And so here is a very outspoken state rep from Smith County. And he takes the bus to come to Nashville for the legislative sessions. So he gets on the bus and he is somewhat confused about the time. And so he gets on the bus and misses the session that he wanted to vote in. So he was really upset about this. And he says, I'm going to do something. I'm going to introduce a bill about this. So he and a state rep from Gallatin put their heads together. And because what do they think? They think that Nashville and Memphis run the state, meaning the General Assembly. And so they want to do something about this. So they get a bill passed, and Governor Browning signs the bill in 1949. And so here we're still kind of working on the time and whether we're going to be on daylight savings time or not. And so then our Congressman, Richard Fulton, proposes that daylight savings time needs to apply to the entire United States, not just to the states that want to be on daylight savings time. And so President Nixon signed the bill in 1974, and people are still complaining about it. And so here we're constantly still bringing this subject up because so many people have something to say about why they don't like daylight savings time or why they absolutely love it. So President Trump in 2018 said he supported a bill to do something about this, but the bill did not pass. And it was reintroduced with bipartisan support, but we still haven't quite gotten very far with the Sunshine Protection Act. And so here we've got switching time and not switching time. We are still debating this. But all of this goes back really to the meaning of light. Light is good, dark is bad. Hell is dark, heaven is full of beautiful sunshine and light. And this is a theme throughout a lot of American history. Light is good, dark is night. And so I think kind of the worst kind of solitary confinement would be to be put in a small cell with no light. No electric light, no windows. I think that would make you go crazy. It would make me go crazy. Of course, a lot of other things might too. But nonetheless, here we have still this debate. We are in lots of different time zones, but it kind of livens things up when you go to California and you're 2 time zones away, and then you go to New York and you're 1 time zone away. So we can deal with this. We're big people. And now that we've got digital watches and phones, the clock in my phone just automatically, as soon as I fly over that line, my phone, if it's on, it switches to Eastern time or Pacific time. So time is with us, but time and light are all part of Christian theology. And so once you start looking at references to light, whether it's in the bulletin today, whether it's in a hymn, however it is, those words about light refer to God or Jesus. Let there be light. Now, I think I have about used up all of my time. Anybody have something they would like to add? Yes, Dick. Just 18 miles away, and then sometimes during the year, it was 2 hours difference because Yeah. Yeah, it was very confusing. And, I think there's some people that are still very resistant to it. But if time really controls us more than anything else, I think right now.
I think before the railroads came to work, folks that stay on the seas needed to know their longitude and
Yeah.
figured out the best way to determine longitude is to get a fixed point, like Greenwich, England, for example, and then measure the time between the time that there and the time where you are when the sun hits its high point, which is depending on when your longitude, and measure how many hours, say 4 hours behind England or whatever, then that means 60 degrees longitude to the west of England. So in the old slavery movies, when you see them marking on the sun, they're marking when it hits its high point. That's when it's near where you are. You compare that to the top of Greenwich, that's your longitude.
Yeah, and see, science builds on itself. I mean, somebody comes up with one idea and it's how to measure latitude, and then they come up with a way to, when you're on a boat, to measure longitude so that you can find Florida, if that's where you're coming from, Spain, or the Caribbean, or South America. And so the longitude was a little bit harder to get a device to do it, but science builds on itself. And so that is why we have all of these smart watches, smart everything. And there was an article, I think, this past week in the New York Times about the fact that elite colleges find out that their enrollees never read a book in high school. They never read a novel, or they didn't read the classics. And so I think Shakespeare's plays. And so, it's kind of interesting that we have this abundance of knowledge, and especially students. Why do I have to learn anything? Why do I have to do this? Because it's all right here. I can Google my question and get it answered. So, that's a huge problem now. Yes.
Can you go back one slide?
Uh-huh.
So, are we going? I thought I saw a slide where we will have to change the time from.
Well, yeah. Yeah, and that was here in Tennessee, because they did not want, after that congressman, a state legislator from Smith County missed his bus. We are not. Not that I've heard, but but I'm sure that people are always calling up their legislature, their state legislature, their state senators, or even their congressman, and complaining. I mean, I think that's the people that answer the phone at the congressman's offices here. They hear nothing but complaints about this, that, and the other. And yet, their jobs are actually pretty easy, because the people who have the hardest job of an elected official, in my opinion, are the Metro Council members, because the district council members are the ones that get called when your neighbor's dog is barking all night, or you don't like the fact that your neighbor didn't mow their yard, or that their son had a rock band going at 2 a.m. Those are the kind of calls the council people get. And if you're sitting down at the legislature, whether you're a state senator or a state representative, you don't get those complaint calls. When is the chipper truck coming to my house? So you don't get those calls if you're down there.
They may have one single time on the channel that might make that up, but I might not.
I don't know. I've never been to China. And I'm sure some of y'all have.
Carol, to Hank's question, I don't read much in science, fortunately, but years ago I stumbled across a book launched by the former head of neuroscience science, and it was fascinating. And it was about how an Englishman figured out how to make a pocket watch, basically, and happened to cook it on his And it's all, there was like a 10 million pound offering from the Royal Observatory to figure out how to do launching. And they wouldn't give the guy the prize because he was, middle class craftsman. But it solved the problem of how to do the launching.
They knew how, everybody knew how to figure, what they didn't know was how to make the time reliable, when you went on stage, or whatever.
Yeah.
And everybody knew you pick things for your hour, they didn't like it.
And a good book on one of the chapters, the first sentence is one word, self. And it's a terrific little read, so.
Census is something hard to build around anything whatsoever related to time because, most of us are now retired and, we just do what we please, right?
What are your next week classes?
And next week is going to be saints, it's going to be saints and others added to it. And, the first week is, going to be Presbyterian's influence on the founding of the United States, their presence in the Declaration of Independence, their presence in the Constitution, James Madison going to Princeton from Virginia. It's going to be about the Presbyterian influence. And, just think about this. What's the name of our legislature legally? The General Assembly. And why is it called the General Assembly? Came from 175 Scots, founded by Scots Irish Presbyterians. So there's a lot of little things like that.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Our time has run out. Let me close with a prayer. Oh God, 1,000 ages in thy sight is like a day just gone. We're mindful of how you care for us in all the seasons of life. We're grateful for Carol and her erudition and the gift she has in teaching. So teach us to number our days. Send us now into the day, enjoy Sabbath and the beauty of the day, or to worship. We thank you, Lord, for this time together. For it's in Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you, friend.